A project is dying, and everyone on the team can feel it. The numbers are soft, the timeline keeps slipping, morale is draining out of the room in every status meeting, and yet, when the moment comes to decide whether to keep funding it, the answer is almost always yes. That decision has almost nothing to do with where the project is actually headed. It has everything to do with where it's already been. This is the sunk cost fallacy, and once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it in every organization you've ever worked in. It describes the tendency to keep investing in something specifically because of resources already spent, money, time, effort, even though those past resources are gone, no matter what happens next. You cannot get them back by spending more. You cannot get them back by spending less. They are simply gone, and the only real question left is what happens from here. Economically, this should be trivial. A rational decision maker only weighs future costs against future benefits. What you already spent is what economists call a sunk cost. And a sunk cost, by definition, carries no information about what you should do next. It happened. It's history. The only inputs that matter for a good decision are, what will this cost from today forward? And what will it deliver from today forward? Everything before today is irrelevant to that calculation. Psychologically, sunk costs are almost never irrelevant. They dominate the decision. This gap between what should matter and what actually drives the choice is one of the most well-documented and consistently replicated findings in behavioral economics and organizational psychology. The clearest demonstration of this comes from a 1985 study by researchers Hal Arkis and Catherine Bloomer. They gave participants a hypothetical scenario. A company has already sunk significant resources into building an airplane, and the project is nearly finished. Then a competitor releases a plane that is superior on the market, right as the original project nears completion. Participants were asked to choose: keep funding the existing project through to completion, or write off the money already spent and stop. People overwhelmingly chose to keep funding the doomed project through to completion. Not because the math favored it, a superior competing product already existed on the market, which should have made the decision easy. They chose to keep going because of how much had already been invested. The size of the past investment, not the quality of the future outcome, drove the decision. That is the sunk cost fallacy in its purest, most stripped-down form, with every other variable held constant, so the bias has nowhere to hide. So why does a species capable of building airplanes fall for something this basic? The mechanism is worth understanding in some depth, because it isn't one bias, it's several psychological forces stacking on top of each other, each one small on its own, and each one pointed in exactly the same unhelpful direction. The first force is loss aversion. Decades of research in behavioral economics, most famously the work underlying prospect theory, has shown that losses register more intensely in the mind than equivalent gains register as pleasure. Losing $1 hurts more than gaining $1 feels good. And the gap between those two feelings is large and remarkably consistent across contexts. Writing off a sunk investment doesn't feel like no longer spending money on a failing thing. It feels like locking in a loss permanently, right now, with your name attached to it. Continuing to fund the project, by contrast, feels like keeping the door open like the loss hasn't fully happened yet, even when, mathematically, it already has and no future spending can undo it. The second force is cognitive dissonance and the need for self-consistency. Human beings have a powerful psychological need to see their own past decisions as reasonable and their own judgment as sound over time. If you approved a project, staffed it, defended it in meetings, and told your boss it would work, killing it now doesn't just end a project. It forces you to hold two conflicting ideas in your head at once. I am a competent decision maker, and I championed something that failed. Continuing to fund the project resolves that tension without requiring you to update your self-image at all. It lets you keep believing the original call was sound, just early, just slightly mistimed, rather than simply wrong. The third force is identity and reputation protection, which is separate from simple internal dissonance, because it's about how the decision will look to other people, not just how it feels privately. Killing a project you publicly backed can feel like a public confession, delivered in front of the same people you convinced to support it. Continuing to fund it defers that reckoning, sometimes indefinitely, sometimes well past the point where anyone else in the room even remembers whose idea it originally was. Put those three forces together, loss aversion, self-consistency, and reputation protection, and you get a decision maker who experiences "stop funding this" as far more painful than it actually is, and "keep funding this" as far safer than it actually is. The fallacy isn't stupidity, and it isn't unique to any one manager's character. It's a set of very normal, very human psychological defenses, all pointed in the same unhelpful direction at once, in nearly every person who has ever had to make this call. It helps to see this dynamic outside of airplanes and abstract lab studies, in the kind of situation a manager actually runs into on an ordinary Tuesday. Imagine a product team that spent 18 months building a feature nobody had asked for loudly enough to justify the build in the first place. Early user testing was lukewarm at best. Adoption after launch stayed flat for months. Every fresh piece of evidence, month after month, says stop. But the team keeps iterating on it anyway, shipping small tweaks, running one more round of testing, because 18 months of engineering time is sitting behind it, and nobody wants to be the person who says those 18 months were wasted out loud, in a room, in front of leadership. Notice what's actually happening in that room. Nobody is arguing the feature is good anymore. They're arguing it would be wasteful to stop now, which is exactly the sunk cost fallacy, wearing the costume of prudence and careful stewardship. Or imagine a hiring situation, which plays out in nearly identical shape in almost every company of any size. A manager brings someone onto the team, invests weeks in training them, vouches for them personally to leadership, and then watches performance stay stubbornly below bar for months on end. The honest move for the team, for the struggling employee, for the manager's own long-term credibility, is usually to have the direct conversation earlier rather than later. Instead, the manager keeps investing more coaching time, more chances, more benefit of the doubt, in part because so much has already been invested in making this particular hire work out. The training hours already spent cannot be recovered by spending more training hours. But from inside the decision, in the moment, it rarely feels that way. A third scenario is worth adding because it shows the pattern at the level of an entire strategy, rather than a single feature or hire. Imagine a company that entered a market 3 years ago, built a sales team around it, and signed early partnerships to support it. The market itself has since shifted. Competitors with structurally better cost positions have moved in, and the unit economics no longer work under any reasonable forecast. Leadership keeps the division running anyway, citing the sales team already built, the partnerships already signed, and the multi-year narrative already told to the board. Every one of those reasons is really the same reason, restated 3 different ways. A lot has already been spent, and admitting that changes nothing about whether more should be spent going forward. These are illustrative scenarios, not case studies of any specific real company. The underlying pattern is what matters here, not any particular name or number, and it shows up in engineering, marketing, sales, hiring, and leadership decisions in more or less identical shape every single time. The sunk cost fallacy doesn't operate alone. It sits inside a small cluster of closely related biases, and understanding how they reinforce each other explains why failing projects can survive for years inside otherwise well-run, well-staffed organizations. The closest relative is escalation of commitment, a concept studied extensively in organizational behavior research going back to work by Barry Storr in the 1970s. Escalation of commitment describes the pattern where decision-makers respond to a failing course of action not by pulling back, but by investing even more, doubling down specifically because the current approach isn't working, as if more resolve can substitute for a strategy that the evidence no longer supports. Sunk cost thinking is one of the main engines that drives escalation. But escalation adds an important extra twist to the picture. It tends to be strongest in the very people who made the original decision, not weakest. The person who greenlit the project has the most identity wrapped up in its success, which means they are often the last person in the room capable of killing it cleanly, precisely when they're the person with the most formal authority to do so. That inversion is worth sitting with for a second, because it cuts against the assumption most organizations quietly operate on by default, the assumption that the original decision-maker is naturally the right person to decide whether their own project should keep going. Frequently, They're the worst positioned person for that specific call, not because they're less competent or less honest than anyone else in the building, but because they have the most psychological skin in the game, and psychological skin in the game distorts judgment in a very specific, very predictable direction. Loss aversion, mentioned earlier as part of the underlying mechanism, is itself a specific, well-documented finding from prospect theory, the framework developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky to describe how people actually evaluate risk and reward, as opposed to how classical economic models assumed a purely rational actor would. Sunk cost thinking can be understood as loss aversion. Applied across time, the loss you're avoiding isn't a future loss you might incur. It's the acknowledgement of a loss that has, in truth, already happened. Confirmation bias plays a supporting role in the same story. Once a team is emotionally and reputationally committed to a project, they tend to notice and remember the signals that support continuing a slightly better week of metrics: one enthusiastic customer email, a single positive comment in a review while discounting, or quietly explaining away the signals that suggest stopping. This selectively filtered evidence stream then gets used, in complete good faith, to justify the exact funding decision that sunk cost pressure already wanted the team to make before any evidence was even reviewed. And in group settings, there's a social layer on top of all of this that individual-level psychology doesn't fully capture on its own: groupthink and social proof. If the most senior person in the room seems visibly committed to continuing, junior team members tend not to voice their doubts, even private ones they've discussed quietly with each other beforehand, which makes the room look far more unanimous in favor of continuing than any single individual inside it actually is. A project can look like it has broad, genuine organizational conviction behind it, when what it actually has is a room full of people individually unsure, each one assuming everyone else in the room must know something they personally don't. But here's the part that catches most managers off guard, and it's worth pausing on directly rather than rushing past it. The people most likely to keep funding a dying project are usually the very people who started it. That's not a coincidence. And it's not really about ego in the shallow, dismissive sense either. It's the direct, predictable output of stacking, loss aversion, self-consistency, reputation protection, and escalation of commitment on top of each other, all pointed at the same single person at the same time. If you're waiting for a project's original champion to be the one who calls time on it themselves, you may be waiting for something that structurally tends not to happen on its own, which means the fix has to be structural too. It can't just be hope the right person eventually has a moment of clarity, because that moment, for very well understood psychological reasons, tends not to arrive on schedule. So what does the discipline actually look like in practice? For a manager who genuinely wants to avoid getting trapped by their own past decisions, the first move is to evaluate a project only on what it will cost and what it will deliver from today forward, treating everything already spent as completely separate information relevant to a postmortem later, irrelevant to this particular decision right now. A useful habit here is to literally ask, out loud, in the room, in front of other people, if we were starting from zero today, with none of the current sunk investment behind us, would we choose to start this project at this cost for this expected outcome? If the honest answer is no, the amount already spent is not a reason to continue. It's simply the explanation for why people are tempted to continue anyway. The second move is to build kill criteria before a project starts, not after it's already struggling and everyone is emotionally invested. Decide in advance, while everyone involved is still optimistic and thinking clearly, exactly what specific signals would mean we stop, no further discussion. Write them down, somewhere visible. Revisit them at fixed checkpoints regardless of how anyone happens to feel that week. This works because it moves the emotionally loaded decision to a moment when nobody yet has ego or reputation riding on the outcome, which strips out most of the loss aversion and self-consistency pressure that distorts the decision later. Once real money and real reputations are on the line, the third move is to rotate the decision-maker away from the original champion. Given that the person who started a project is structurally the worst positioned person to call time on it, a second, less personally invested reviewer, a peer, a different department head, A skip-level manager should have real, binding authority in the go or no-go conversation, not just a rubber stamp role that exists on paper only. This directly counters the escalation of commitment dynamic by removing the single point of concentrated psychological bias from the final call. The fourth move is to actively reward people for killing bad projects, not only for shipping successful ones. If the only visible career outcome tied to a project is "it worked" or "it was a costly mistake we don't talk about," the organization has quietly built an incentive system that punishes anyone who says stop early, which pushes every manager in the building toward the exact behavior Arks and Bloomer documented decades ago, publicly recognizing someone for stopping a doomed initiative 6 months earlier than they technically had to, and explicitly naming the resources that specific decision saved changes what good judgment actually looks like inside a team's real incentive structure, not just inside its stated values on a slide somewhere. None of this makes killing a project pleasant, and it shouldn't. Ending something that people worked hard on, believed in personally, and defended in front of others is genuinely difficult, and treating it as a purely mechanical spreadsheet decision misses the real human cost of getting the call wrong in either direction. Killing something too early can be just as costly to a team as keeping something alive too long. The goal here isn't to become immune to loyalty or conviction as a manager. The goal is to make sure loyalty to a project and honesty about that project's actual future aren't quietly getting confused with each other, which is precisely what sunk cost pressure does whenever it's left unmanaged and undiscussed. If there's one thing worth sitting with after all of this, it's that the sunk cost fallacy almost never announces itself plainly. Nobody in that room ever says out loud, "We're doing this because we already spent the money." It gets dressed up instead, in the language of virtue, persistence, commitment, not giving up too early, believing in the team when things get hard. Those are real values, genuinely worth having. And that overlap is exactly what makes the fallacy so hard to catch in real time. It borrows the vocabulary of good judgment to defend a decision that good judgment, examined honestly, would actually reject. The practical takeaway for any manager sitting across the table from a struggling project is simple to state and considerably harder to practice. Judge it only on what it will cost and deliver, starting today, completely separate from what has already been spent, and build the structure that supports that judgment kill criteria, a second decision maker, real incentives for stopping before you need it, not while you're already sitting inside the exact decision you're trying to escape. Money already spent cannot be protected by spending more of it. Only the decision from here forward can actually change the outcome that follows. Follow for more theories that actually explain your workplace.